In many ways, the modern gaming landscape is still strongly tied to the now classic arcade games of the 80s and 90s. Street Fighter VI is indebted to Street Fighter II, 2D Mario is indebted to Pac-Man, and Bankruptcy Simulator, Cute Girl Edition, now with cute boys, is indebted to the same quarter-guzzling design philosophy that defined the arcade scene. Many of the companies behind these older games are still around, or all their junk got bought up, and as a result, it's not hard to find a lot of these historic titles in places like Steam, ensuring a large chunk of arcade history, even the weird stuff, is officially preserved for the foreseeable future. There's one problem though. I'm a heckin' Zoomerino! Chonk chonk dog dog! Wait, is that millennial? I don't know what the kids think millennials are like. I don't know, man. I'm a bad Zoomer because I just called younger Zoomers the kids. It may come as a shock, but I wasn't hanging around dingy arcades in the 90s, feeding a rusted old cabinet hundreds of dollars in quarters so that I could hone my column skills. I'm normal, mostly. And I've gotta be honest, while I'm grateful for a lot of these compilations, and I always love screwing with them, it can be tough to engage with some of these games, especially when they're presented as a boring list. It's like I'm browsing through someone else's MAME ROMs. Some of these dusty things are straight up crusty, and they disgust me. If you're flipping through a Rolodex of 50 mostly unfamiliar games, and one gives you a bad first impression, you might end up falling back on what you know. I love weird games. It's like my entire thing, but even I can only do so much. You know what might help? What if I didn't feel like I was flipping through a ROM site with no guidance or direction? What if I could put myself in the shoes of an arcade goer, circa the old times? There's still arcades and barcades around, some of which leave their machines on free play, so you don't have to shovel quarters into the bad games, but not every arcade is going to have every game, and hey, you might not even have an arcade near you to begin with. I'm not really in the mood for a night out myself. I want to sit in front of my TV and bring the arcade to me. Let's explore virtual arcades. These games go out of their way to replicate the arcade experience beyond just emulating older titles, and each one has its own way of putting you into these pretend spaces and getting you immersed. Let's start with a somewhat recent example, Pac-Man Museum Plus. This is an updated version of the original Pac-Man Museum, which came out in 2014. The presentation in the original isn't much to write home about, but Museum Plus, released in 2022, is a different story. The game features an arcade as your hub world, placing you in the role of Pac-Man. Sometimes he does little Pac-Man World animations, it's cute. This is a compilation of mostly arcade titles. As such, cabinets are strewn about, ready to be played. You even have in-game coins to put in the machines. No free play here. You start with around 500 and earn more as you play, so luckily you shouldn't be running too short unless you get addicted to the gachapon machine. More on that later. There's a couple details I really enjoy here, like the cabinet art. It goes so far as to show the Namco Classics Collection Volume 2 logo for 1996's Pac-Man arrangement, since that game was part of a compilation in arcades. Another thing I appreciate is how the non-arcade titles, like Pac-Man 256 and Pac-Attack, are played on this little console setup. Which black box do you think is Pac-Man's favorite? Did he pirate his own games and stick them on a Raspberry Pi? Actually, if this is Pac-Man's arcade, why does he need to put coins into his own machines? Wouldn't he just be fishing them out later? The more you play, the more guests come to visit your arcade. Would they not also be paying for your games, earning you more coins? Maybe he can't open the coin door because of his mitten hands? Get Pac-Marie over here, quick! That aside, I really like how this hub world utilizes the nuances of a real arcade, weaving them into the Pac-Man theme. The muddled, blaring mess of every cabinet running with volume maxed, for example, is very authentic to a real arcade. As long as it's not one of those bitch arcades that plays music or turns the cabinet volume down. Pac-Man has never seen a volume knob in his life. He doesn't have ears, he doesn't have feelings. His arcade doesn't have a door. You live here now with him. Something else I really appreciate is the gachapon machine, where you can put in 5 coins and get a Pac-Man related figure. This is what I mean when I say replicating the arcade experience beyond the games. Who amongst us hasn't been suckered out of a few quarters by something like this? Maybe I should have just done a video on virtual gachapon machines, because I can't lie, I'm a bit of an addict. I blame Danganronpa.
I sure don't know what that is.
I think that's a vibrator.
Cool.
There's sort of a weird situation though, where instead of a lot of the classic iconic characters, there's these weird new ones. Like instead of classic beloved character Ms.
Pac-Man, the beloved character, receives a figure in this game alongside her family, who have always existed in Pac-Man canon and are not legally distinct substitutes for other characters.
You can decorate your arcade with all these figures, but unfortunately, you cannot add an exit.
Please, if you're listening, you gotta send help.
I've been stuck in this arcade for a month. I just want to see my wife. You can also unlock stuff like wallpapers to spruce things up even more. One wallpaper seems to be based on the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man, because I guess that's what's worth remembering. Overall, I'm a pretty big fan of how this game handles its arcade setting, but it looks a little weird, doesn't it? Like, what's with this perspective? Why can I see the void beneath the floor? It's almost laid out like a diorama, which I guess is sort of cute in its own way, but I don't know. It just sort of breaks my immersion. I feel like I'm playing with a toy, not exploring a real place. I mean, I basically am playing with a toy, but no toy player wants to think about that cold reality. Maybe there's an older toy. I mean, digital experience. It feels a little more inviting and less plasticky. So much for feeling less plasticky, huh? In late 1995, players were invited to the Namco Museum for the first time. You definitely own one of these games. You may not think you do, but the scratched up PS2 discs that the previous owner of your apartment left behind don't lie. They're still pumping these out, just to ensure that Pole Position and Galaga remain playable on every platform. What do you mean we can just release them individually on Steam now? We don't do that in this house! We are taking a family trip to the museum, and you are going to like it! No, I don't want to hear any more sass out of any of you, or I'm turning this car around and we're not getting Burger King, okay? I don't care that they have Mario toys. You're gonna go into your room, you're gonna stand in the corner, you look at that wall. A lot of these games are just average compilations, letting you pick your favorite arcade game from the menu. But back in the 90s, things were different. I wasn't here. It sucked. Do you know what didn't suck? The first couple Namco Museum games on PS1. These were a cohesive set, with each volume featuring a single letter from the word Namco on the cover. A fun minimalist look that makes them look really nice together. They clearly planned out these 5 volumes from the beginning, and then they made another one. Just in case you were really jonesing to play some Wonder Momo. Yeah, Namco Museum Encore, a 6th volume released only in Japan, doesn't have any letters left to work with, so it just uses the all rights reserved symbol. The presentation of these PS1 titles is a lot cooler than most modern counterparts, with each volume featuring a first-person hub world, begging to be explored. Each arcade game has its own hall, filled with flyers, pictures of merchandise, readable magazines based on the real-life Namco Community Games, NG magazine from the 80s and early 90s, and tips on how to play, which I think work wonderfully for contextualizing each game. I like that there's no dates listed on any of the merch. It's all just said to have been sold in game centers long ago. Like you're asking your grandpa to describe the local arcade from back in the 80s, and he talks about it like a wise old sage would recount sealing away an ancient evil.
I attained this Pac-Man brush many a year ago, in the dark times, before I uncovered your map of Rally X.
There's also a lounge with a jukebox acting as a sound test, as well as some bonus magazine covers and art. As the series progresses, these are eventually divided into a theater for the sound test and a library for the art. I'm a big fan of the theaters, especially because you can see various Namco characters hanging around, including some pretty obscure ones. I think it's worth noting how much they love Sue from Ms. Pac-Man. She shows up in theaters and in a couple game rooms over the course of the series, even in the intro to Volume 5. They also use Miru from Pac-N-Pal a couple times, despite that game never being featured in the PS1 Namco Museum. The game rooms are found at the end of each hallway, past the memorabilia. Each one matches the corresponding game's identity in some way, except for Toy Pop. That one's just white, like me. You also get to listen to some sweet remixes of the original arcade music. I'm a big fan of the Mappy one in particular. I love a lot of these rooms. Some of my favorites are the Galaga room that takes place inside the ship, the Bosconian space room, and the Ms. Pac-Man room.
Miss Pac-Man.
I appreciate the presence of Chomp Chomp, the huge TV with America on it, and our favorite little lemon licker dropping a deuce. I kinda thought we were playing as Pac-Man, given the animated icon in the corner, but maybe not. Pac-Man's room in Volume 1 doesn't even feature him. Both that room and the Ms. Pac one do, however, feature his house, as depicted in beloved classic Pac-Man 2 The New Adventures, which is a nice touch. While we're talking about the Pac-Man themed rooms, I'm also a fan of Super Pac-Man's. That game's actually not in in the Japanese release. It was added for international players, replacing QDQ, and I'm glad it did. Not because the game is good, you and I both know that it's not, but because, for some reason, the room is a bar featuring a stage show with an audience of ghosts who turn blue when they see Pac-Man chasing one of them. Clyde tends bar while Blinky waits at the machine to watch you play. Inky and Pinky are freaking plastered. I love these games. Although, in comparison to the more modern Pac-Man Museum Plus, the presentation in the earliest installments is a little dry. Let me be clear, I'm not dissing the graphics at all. These are early PS1 games, like pre-analog stick PS1, so they do show their age in some ways, but I'm not concerned about the crusty graphics at all. If I owned the Bible, it'd be a wobbling rectangle. It's more about the way that you meander through the halls. God forbid you actually want to look at anything, lest you be faced with another loading screen before being rewarded with a couple compressed bitmaps. The magazine covers are cool, but I for one think it'd be cooler if you could actually read the magazine. I can't be too mean to these because of when they came out, but there's certainly no replacement for the authentic print material. Sonic Mega Collection, this is not. The ideas and the general presentation are great, but the earlier volumes are, understandably, held back quite a bit by the PS1's limitations. Something starts happening around volume 3 or 4 though. Things start getting interesting. The samey hallways of 1 and 2 start getting more specific to each game, breathing some much needed variety into the package. The game selections also get weirder and weirder, and as such, the later installments are a lot more interesting than the early ones. A lot of post-90s Namco Museums sort of just give you the hits, like we've got Pac-Man, Dig Dug, Mappy, Galaga, maybe Xevious or something if they're feeling really spicy. But because there are 6 volumes on the PS1, they get weird with it, spreading the big games out amongst the different volumes, leaving room for some curveballs each time. Volume 1 starts pretty normal, with the only particularly weird game being Toy Pop, a top-down shooter with a lot of cute 2D artwork, but things start to change as the series goes along. They seem to ration the Pac-Man games at 1 per volume, which is effective if you're using the original game or Ms. Pac-Man, but Volume 4 is literally just Pac-Land and a bunch of late 80s deep cuts. The type of package you couldn't really imagine them releasing today. Encore really scrapes the bottom of the obscurity barrel, with the lineup consisting of King and Balloon, Modos, Sky Kid, Rolling Thunder, Wonder Momo, Rompers, and Dragon Saber. I'm personally a big fan of this because I think every game deserves preservation. I'm just kind of unsure why Namco felt like losing money that year. A lot of these more obscure games are a lot of fun though. I really enjoyed Volume 5's picks, and especially Legend of Valkyrie, which is playable in English for the first time. The only time, to my knowledge, the later Switch port retains the Japanese text in its international releases. I'm glad they hired someone to translate the game, but it's a bit odd they couldn't hire anyone to make cover art other than white text on a black background. Makes it look kind of ominous, like I'm entering the black market. Hey kid, you want the Legend of Valkyrie? You kids like Toy Pop. The games are vertically squashed, but otherwise faithful arcade ports. Ms. Pac's bow is looking a bit rough, but it's technically intact. From what I can gather, they apparently aren't emulation, but they are recreated using the original code, so faithfully that we even get the grody boot up screens. You'll love to see it. Whoa. Volume 5's presentation is probably the best in the series. Instead of simply walking into another room in the museum, you interact with something related to the game in order to be transferred into its world. For example, you eat a few fruits to go into Pac-Mania's exhibit, which is an outside area complete with a cozy log cabin the ghosts live in. I tried to get a closer look at my man Funky, but in my hubris, I grabbed a power pellet, which made them all run away in fear. Except Sue. Why is it always her? Why is she unaffected? Why does she keep turning up? Does she even live here? This increased emphasis on interactive elements is a lot of fun. Another good one is the way you can trip over these soda cans in the Metro Cross room. I think we're losing out a bit on the more formal aspects of the presentation though. The museum is less of a museum, if you know what I mean. I wonder if the developers were getting bored of the more traditional approach. Encore basically scraps the museum entirely in favor of a streamlined menu. I can't help but wonder what we could have had our hands on if a modern Namco museum really embraced the museum aspect again, as opposed to menus are fun. It's not like you need something with a high budget. Pac-Man Museum Plus got by just fine. Imagine a solid game selection, decent movement, nice rooms, and good bonus content. Just decent quality magazine scans and better load times would go such a long way. Use as few polygons as you want. Online leaderboards would be the cherry on top. I'd prefer a bigger game with a more robust library, but you could divvy them out into volumes again if you really want to. The arcade versions of these games aren't actually as easy to come by on modern platforms as one might think. The Namco Museum's archive line on Steam actually contains contains the NES ports of a lot of these games rather than the originals. It's still cool and worth preserving, but not as authentic. This one's got kind of a cool shelf thing going on where you can look at the cartridges, but most Namco museums don't even bother trying with their presentation. Namco Museum 50th Anniversary on the GameCube, Xbox, and PS2 does put up a nice attempt with its menu. There's no explorable museum, but the game selection is presented as a circle of arcade machines with very good-looking models of the cabinets. It also features 5 licensed songs from the 80s that play while you're picking your game. This is a really interesting method of contextualization that very few other games have tried to my knowledge. If you're listening to Working for the Weekend, you're in the right headspace to play Bosconian. Regretfully, the Japanese version of the game strips out these songs and replaces them with an original. I suppose Loverboy isn't as nostalgic to Japanese players, and licensing something by Henri would have put them grossly over budget. Namco Museum Remix and its updated re-release Megamix on the Wii, which focused primarily on weird modern versions of a bunch of old arcade titles, also features the Carnival Arcade, where you can play the originals. I really like the designs of the machines here. They're not exactly arcade accurate, but I appreciate how they use imagery from the games. My favorite is probably the Pac-Man machine shaped like Miru. The Carnival Arcade is pretty cool, but it doesn't really have the same level of presentation or interactivity of the PS1 Namco museums, or even Pac-Man Museum Plus. They really just squeezed them all together. Whoever owns this place couldn't spring for a building with more than one room. It also sucks that despite each arcade title allowing you to use either a solo Wiimote, a classic controller, or a Wiimote nunchuck combo, the game forces you to use the nunchuck to navigate the overworld, which means you need to have it to boot into anything. You can't even switch between games with none of the other control methods. You need to plug it in and take it back out. Maybe a list of MAME ROMs wouldn't be so bad, actually. At least a quick start option on the main menu for the households unfortunate enough to lose their only nunchuck. I was in that boat when I tried to play this for the video. I had to sail up Lake Mooch off my friends to get this working, and believe you me, it is a miracle I lived to see shore. I like Grabda just as much as the next guy, but I don't know if it's worth quite that much effort. The other Namco Museum games are mostly nothing to write home about. Not even Namco Museum Virtual Arcade features a virtual arcade. Where did the love go? Namco has given me no option but to leave the museum and to go searching elsewhere. If anyone wants this annual pass, let me know. Of course, in reality, most people's lives exist outside of the confines of the arcade. Not me. I never leave my house, and with the amount of my finite income I've spent on useless bullshit, you could charitably call my home an arcade if you don't want to use the word mess instead. But I'm not the everyman. Most people have modest and respectable day jobs, like running cabaret clubs or beating up squatters to keep property values up. And for these people, a leisurely trip to the arcade is but one part of their busy day. The Yakuza franchise is sort of what I'd consider the gold standard of a virtual arcade experience in many ways. I'm currently playing through Yakuza 0, which is my introduction to the franchise, so let's take that game as an example. 0 takes place in late 1988 and early 1989, and features 2 cities, Kamurocho, based off Tokyo's Kabukicho Entertainment District, and Sotenbori, based off of Osaka's Dotonbori. These areas are lovingly rendered, with all sorts of hotspots in the forms of side quests and minigames for our 2 protagonists to enjoy. Both districts contain arcades, with Kamurocho having 2. All of these are modeled after Sega's real-world high-tech land locations, featuring actual Sega arcade games that existed during the years these games take place. Outrun and Space Harrier are unlocked from the beginning. Sotenbori has 1 arcade with both games, while Kamurocho separates them between its 2 arcades. This would already be a pretty sweet extra on its own, but the arcades have more to do than just impressing bystanders with your sick drifts, ladies. Kiryu and Majima, the game's playable characters, can talk to the attendants of each arcade, and they'll actually challenge you to beat their high scores in both games. Do this enough times and they'll offer an enticing reward. Our friend Kyoko offers to show Majima her fantasy zone if he's able to beat her final high score of 2 million points. She's talking about the video game. As if that wasn't enough, Majima also has a side quest involving a child loitering outside the arcade. Instead of throwing her in prison like the law-breaking scum she is, Majima talks to the child and finds out she wants one of the dolls in the arcade's claw machines. Yes, this arcade's got a playable claw machine. Would you believe I'm better at this than I am at the real ones? After spending hundreds of thousands of yen on a toy that was manufactured for no more than $5, you can give it to the kid and the side quest will continue from there. I won't spoil the rest of it, it rules. Things like claw machine side quests and hiding game unlocks behind the friendships you can forge with minimum wage arcade employees really adds to the feeling of authenticity. Real arcades aren't about putting some obscure magazine scan or ugly flyer under a microscope. Real arcades arcades are about wasting too much money on a claw machine, and, if you're lucky, taking home a toy you don't need. I'm partial to the Mega Drive with arms and legs myself. Can you say friend-shaped? I can say friend-shaped. In one of the later games, you can even win plushies of my 4 favorite monkeys.
Monkey!
I was but a twinkle in the eyes of the universe in the 80s, so I never got to experience an arcade like this, much less a Japanese one. But I assume the development of friendships and rivalries played a big part in their appeal. I have to say, as someone who often struggles playing old arcade games without a clear ending or win condition, putting a face and personality to the high score on the screen really made me appreciate Space Harrier and especially Outrun a lot more. There is progression, and it's not all about getting to the end. You enjoy the journey, slowly improving and being rewarded for your patience by seeing more of the game. This is what arcade games are about. This is what I was missing. The only downside is, once you befriend these ladies and unlock the games that I assume they were keeping in the back or something, there's not much more to do with them. You can still go to the arcade and play all these games, and they'll smile and say that they hope you enjoy your visit, but that's about it. Have we beaten their competitive streaks out of them? Have they resigned themselves to falling further down the leaderboard while Kiryu's virtual racing skills continue to evolve? I feel kinda bad. Coming to the arcade to blow off some steam remains a fun thing to do, especially now that I've developed an appreciation for these games. I just wish there was a way to keep that initial atmosphere and excitement going, you know? I've also seen and agreed with some criticism regarding arcades and newer Yakuza, Like a Dragon games. This isn't so much the games themselves, but more so how some of Sega's older titles are only re-released as part of these Like a Dragon arcades and not on their own. Do you want to play Sonic the Fighters on PC? Fighting Vipers 2 on something other than Dreamcast? You best shell out $60 for Karaoke Simulator 2024. It's definitely good these games are getting re-released at all, and I like that they're here, but I personally think it'd also be nice to just toss them on Steam. Game preservation. Preserve your games. Put them on Steam! Alright, I think Namco's been in timeout for long enough. Let's talk about Pac-Man World 2. This game is, of course, a 3D platformer, but it does feature an arcade in the opening area, Pac Village. Its owner is named Sue. I assume this isn't the same Sue from Ms. Pac-Man and all those Namco Museum games from earlier, but who knows? Maybe she regained her physical form. I don't think she'd look quite like this, though. She looks like a grandma who works in a bakery or something. I'm not saying grandmas can't be mysterious, stalkery agents of chaos, but this one's not looking like that if you ask me. I love her little ice cream hair, but she doesn't seem like much of a gamer. Doesn't really say much, just tells you how to unlock the game. Seems like she doesn't really have any other staff on hand though. Maybe she really is passionate about games. Odds are high she kicks my ass in Ms. Pac-Man. Speaking of Ms. Pac-Man, that game is the final unlockable here, with the other games being Pac-Man, Pac-Attack, Pac-Mania, and the mazes from Pac-Man World 2 itself. There's also another sound test jukebox, but it just has World 2 music, none of the arcade stuff. You unlock each game by collecting tokens, which are hidden throughout the main game. The arcade titles are presented in their PS1 Namco Museum forms for the most part. Whoa, looks like Sue put LCD screens in the arcade cabinets. Doesn't care about authenticity, just gotta get everything done cheap because it's all about money to her! I'm loving the big crusty arcade cabinets, which use the original logos for the games on the front and weird generic Pac-Man art on the sides. These machines look like TV remotes with big old batteries bulging out the back. It rules. I really enjoy exploring an arcade through this perspective, more so than the diorama approach that Museum Plus goes for. I also like the idea of seeing the arcade employees, like in Yakuza, although, again, there's just one. Weird idea, but how cool would it be if there was a virtual arcade where the Pac Store pop-up shop characters were the staff? We'd actually use Pac-Marie for something. Anyways, I think taking a more Yakuza approach by having some extra dialogue or incentive to play the games would add a lot here, but this is still a fun little bonus in its current form. Except Pac-Attack. That game kind of sucks.
No, you couldn't handle this. Everyone who battled me, they falling like an avalanche. Got them falling back to back. Take them all just hand in hand. Y'all going home, so better pack your bags.
Despite many attempts to get into Street Fighter in the past, 6 was the first entry to really hook me. I came for the character creator and the World Tour mode, using the simplified modern controls to dip my feet in. I stayed for the satisfaction of learning the classic controls, getting into heated battles with friends, and admiring all the sweaty, glistening abs. Oh, and Chun-Li. I like Chun-Li. I like Chun-Li so much I bought this car. Showing it in this video justifies the money I spent on it. In many ways, Street Fighter 6 is a game for people like me. A game for the beginner. Yet it's also covered in Capcom history, taking place years after the last entry in the timeline. As such, which, it makes sense that the Battle Hub, the game's online lobby area, features a rotating selection of Capcom arcade cabinets for you to try. When I tried it for this video, the games available were Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Final Fight, and Vulgus. I'm a pretty big fan of how these are implemented. The cabinets are all set up in their own little area of the Battle Hub, featuring some art and other info when selected. The cabinets themselves are just generic, but have you seen any Capcom games in a real arcade? This is true to life. I enjoy the idea of arcade cabinets being set up in places that aren't explicitly arcades, like Catherine, for example, takes place in a dingy bar with a crappy beat-up arcade machine in the corner. That one lets you play Rapunzel, essentially an arcade version of the main game's puzzles. I think it'd be a cool idea to use real games for this more often. Imagine if you were playing a Namco game and there was an ancient Ms. Pac-Man cabinet in the corner of some bar. The games in Street Fighter 6 lack online multiplayer, but apparently do allow for local play, which is kind of rad. You have the option of either playing with unlimited credits or playing on 1 credit for a high score, which you can compare to other players on an online leaderboard. I love this feature. It maintains some of the competitive spirit of a real arcade, sort of like Yakuza, but with real people. There is a few drawbacks, though. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo uses the American ROM, which, to my understanding, contains a glitch that prevents the difficulty from being altered. Whether you set it to easy or hard, the game is just gonna play on hard, which is kind of a bummer. There's also a mandatory scanline filter over all the games. I don't hate it, but you're not exactly getting a robust compilation experience. I guess it does help to emulate the arcade experience, but if you really want to emulate the arcade experience, I'd suggest pouring a beer on your fight stick so that you're desperately struggling for your life every time you try to quarter circle. The biggest crime here, though, is the fact that due to the rotating game selection, Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo is not a permanent fixture. Instead, I'm stuck with Vulgus, a game for bitches. I ain't a bitch. There's always the Capcom Fighting Collection, but that's just a regular compilation. My hands are sticky and I've ruined this $80 controller. Where's my authentic arcade experience? Oh, the games are in Street Fighter 6 so that Capcom can sell them to you outside of Street Fighter 6. Clever dog. Capcom Arcade Stadium is a free-to-play game, almost a platform, really. You get one game, 1943, on the house, and can choose to buy a wide variety of other Capcom arcade titles as DLC. I kinda like this approach, actually. The games are pretty inexpensive at $2 a piece, which means you don't have to pay $40 if you only want 1 or 2 of the games. I wish I'd known that before I shelled out for Capcom Fighting Collection. Really, I just wanted Pocket Fighter. I guess I own the Darkstalkers games now? I'm not good at them, but they're always there. I actually own most of them twice now, because I then bought them in Capcom Arcade Stadium for this video. Good thing my friends and I have been getting into Darkstalkers since I wrote this script. Listen, I'm not actively seeking financial advice, but if you have any, I'm all ears. I like Arcade Stadium's presentation a lot. The amount of customization is easily the best of any game we'll be talking about today. You can actually turn the attract mode sounds on and off for each individual game. You can also change what type of cabinet each game uses, and you can even unlock more of them. This would be cool enough as just a menu thing, but you can actually choose to use a sort of 3D border that lets you see the cabinet as you play the game. You can even use the right stick to move the camera and look at the other machines. I'm so immersed. Street Fighter 2 is right there. If you move the left stick before you start a game, you can actually move the little left stick on the cabinet in-game, which just tickles me. There's plenty of screen filtering options too. You can Street Fighter 6 it, you can go full immersion mode, or you can rock with no filters or borders like the purist you are. You can also alter the dip switch settings on each game and pick between the English or Japanese version. Finally, I can play Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo on my preferred difficulty. Baby easy. There's also a few challenge options present: score, timed, and special, which net you access to online leaderboards, adding a little motivation to your game. Unfortunately, your score does have to reach a minimum value before you show up on the leaderboard, and I suck at Sun, so that's not happening. I managed to clear the threshold for Puzzle Fighter, but it still didn't show me where I was on the leaderboard. Guess I'll check back later? You can play the games in any manner you like for score and timed mode, but for special, there are preset conditions. For example, in Sun, the special challenge requires you to play on very hard difficulty with 3 lives, locking me out of cheesing my way through the game on easy with 7 lives. Well, I'm never gonna be any good if I don't practice. Let's try out Hyper Street Fighter 2. Where is Hyper Street Fighter 2? Yeah, so a couple months after the game's initial release on Switch, Capcom Capcom announced that more arcade titles were on the way. Then, a year later, they just decided they were making a whole new game, I guess. What's even the point of the DLC-based model, then? The same year, they also announced Capcom Fighting Collection. You remember Capcom Fighting Collection, a more traditional compilation with a lot of the same games Second Stadium has. It does also have Red Earth and 2 extra Darkstalkers games, which has gotta be kind of a kick in the pants if you've already gone all in on Arcade Stadium DLC. Now you have to buy a $40 compilation with a bunch of games you already own just to get a few more. Must be devastating being Red Earth's strongest soldier without so much as a virtual arcade cabinet to show for it. If you pre-ordered the Fighting Collection, you'd actually get a bonus game in Second Stadium, 3 Wonders. So I guess Capcom actually wants you to double dip? Am I making you happy, Capcom? One other thing I'm not a fan of is the fact that every game you can get will be present in your arcade whether or not you've actually bought them, meaning they'll all sit there mocking you until you drop that 99 cents. I hate it. The games also contain additional paid DLC in the form of extra borders, invincibility in all the games, which, write this down, is free in Second Stadium but costs $1 in the first one, and soundtracks for the various games. Other than some of these weird details, this is one of my favorite virtual arcades. The extensive customization and immaculate presentation really add a lot. Oh shit, it's Johnny, it's me, Johnny, and welcome back to the impromptu part in the middle of the video where I do the Patreon read. I was like, yeah, I'm coming off hiatus, and then a bunch of stuff happened. I moved, got a new job, so sorry this took so long. I can't promise the next one won't also take long, but these are my patrons. These are my wonderful patrons, and they donated $1 to get their names on the screen, and some of them donated $5 a month at the Cosmic Kitty tier to get me to read their names out loud, and those people are Bowties and Glasses, there's a space, Giant Fire Ring Cole, Gritspot, hello Gritspot, June Crash Radio, Pac Jeff, and Pigpen. They also got to see a rough draft of this video a week or two early, and other stuff sometimes. I don't consistently provide all that much to the Patreon, but every so often you get bloopers, sometimes you get early access to videos. It's really, it's more of a tip jar, but I do like to provide things, if I can. No promises. But yeah, thank you for waiting so goddamn long, and thank you patrons for helping to keep me afloat. It has been a weird couple months financially, but I think we're crawling our way out of that now. And watch the rest of the video, please. It took me so long. I made it for you. Watch it. Watch it now! Depending on who you ask, Shenmue is either a cult classic or a primitive, primordial version of Yakuza without any of the fun parts.
Years ago, I was Chinese.
My opinion is somewhere in the middle. I played some of it on Steam for this video, and it sure has aged. Shenmue revolves around the main character Ryo trying to avenge his father's death, and to do that, he has to talk to every passerby he comes across in order to track down his dad's killer.
Excuse me.
Huh? Who the hell you think you are?
Whoa.
What you want, twit? Want me to kick your ass?
Dude, I hope they do try to kick my ass. That'd be really funny.
Huh? Get out of my space, schoolboy!
These are my favorite characters in the game.
Of course, even if you're hell-bent on reducing the murderer to a pile of ash, that doesn't mean you don't have time to enjoy the finer things in life. One of the most acclaimed and enduring aspects of Shenmue is the world Ryo inhabits. It can be fun to just boot up the game and hang out, exist, in this Dreamcast facsimile of 1986 Japan. You can spend your money on a can of soda, which Ryo chugs immediately, capsule machines anachronistically featuring toys of 90s Sega characters like Knights and the complete casts of Virtual Fighter and Sonic the Fighters, and, of course, the U Arcade in Dobuita. 2 capsule machines are strategically placed out front, just like a real arcade might have. And, much like a real capsule machine, I bankrupt myself on these. Can you blame me? Listen, tell me you wouldn't have done the same. Luckily, the games at the arcade only cost 100 yen, so I can still scrape by. Much like Yakuza, going into the arcade reveals some period-appropriate Sega games, in this case, Space Harrier and Hang On. There's also 2 machines used for practicing the game's QuickTime events. One of them takes the form of a fairly traditional arcade cabinet called Excite QTE2, which implies the existence of an Excite QTE1. The other, QTE title, is based on the real Sega game, Big Title. This ain't a game for waggling your silly joystick around. You punch with your actual, Ryo's actual fists. Each punching bag is represented by a different face button, and we cut to dramatic reaction shots of Ryo in between punches. It's actually really fun. The game's commitment to replicating the less video gamey fixtures of a typical arcade doesn't end with its plastic dispensers and boxing simulators. U-Arcade is also equipped with some dartboards. Ryo moves his hand automatically and quite shakily too. Get a grip, dude. And you hit the A button to throw the dart. Dude's always got a comment afterwards too. He's alone in this barren arcade. Only other soul is the owner chilling in the corner, but he feels the need to really cut through that thick silence every chance he gets. At least the owner's got a newspaper with a picture of a real Sega employee on it. Struggling game company liquidates console division, I'm sure it reads. Anyway, after I got the new high score for darts, the owner rewarded me with a miniature replica of the dartboard, and I think I was genuinely more excited than I've ever been in a real arcade. Shenmue's take on the virtual arcade is good, especially for the time, but it can also feel a little bit empty. There's a tabletop machine where two dudes occasionally play what appears to be Fantasy Zone, a game you can't play here, but after a while they'll leave and you'll be stuck with the owner again. If the silence gets too awkward, the arcade also has a jukebox where you can listen to music from various Sega arcade games, including ones that aren't featured here, like Outrun and Afterburner. Overall, I like this one, especially its jukebox and dartboard. It's just a little dingy and deserted for my liking. Maybe that makes it more authentic though. They could have been aiming for the shitty, locally owned vibe with that. Shenmue 2 also has an arcade with all the same machines. They also added Outrun and some competition for the dartboard. I'm gonna need to become a hardcore Shenmue fan just so that I can get here organically. I can see myself dropping hours on shit like this. Shenmue 3's also got one that seems to be a whole lot less of the video gaming arcade stuff, which I'm personally all for. Do people play Shenmue just for the arcades? If that's the appeal, then maybe I do get this game. Going through all these virtual arcades, it makes one wonder about other older ways of gaming. There's something romantic about that platonic ideal of an arcade, some combination of imagination and memory. And while I didn't grow up playing in too many arcades myself, I can certainly say that I feel similarly about older consoles. It's weird to say, but I fondly remember coming home from high school anime club and booting up Splatoon on my Wii U, with the sun peeking through the shades. Other people may have fond nostalgic memories of normal consoles though. There's a reason those classic mini consoles did so well. Playing well-remembered classics with those old controllers in your hands hits different. The NES Classic even comes with a poster that looks like an authentic artifact of that era. You don't even have to bust out a CRT or fix any pesky pin connectors to go back in time. I know playing Mario 3 with the real, honest-to-God NES controller makes me feel a lot different than booting it up with a set of Joy-Cons and an annoying pop-up on the bottom of the screen. So, the question presents itself. Can we contextualize console games in the same way as arcade games? Can we recreate some facsimile of a home console experience in a game itself? Sure, Pac-Man's definitely got some kind of Raspberry Pi setup in his weird revisionist arcade, but I think we can do a bit better than that. I haven't seen as many games try, but I want to briefly look at two examples that dared to try capitalizing on the nostalgia of those long weekends, spent with cartridges scattered about your floor and a strategy guide in hand. One of the first things to come to mind for me, and probably a lot of you, is the original Animal Crossing on GameCube, which famously features some playable NES games. So, I decided to give it a shot. Now, I have to admit, I'm not a hardcore Animal Crossing fan. I've played the new ones a bit, but I'm no diehard. The early days of the franchise were a mystery to me going in. And can I just say, wow, compared to the games I'm used to, this one doesn't let you have anything. Tom Nook put my ass straight to work. The villagers chastised me for being up late, and when I finished playing Errand Girl, Nook's store was closed, not opening again until 9 a.m. I just quit working the night shift in real life. I'm not up at 9 a.m. I guess I'll just have to come back another day. Where the hell is my NES? I've been making an honest living by sucking the earth dry and selling every last byproduct to this Tanuki bitch, and he doesn't even have the decency to stock the one thing I actually want. I guess it was nice of him to give me a whole house with that small of a down payment, but there's some needs that a simple roof over your head won't fix. I may have a house, but without a Nintendo Entertainment System, I'm far from having a home. I needed to know how to get one, so I gave into my impatience and Googled it. Pretend I have Wi-Fi in my town. As it turns out, there's a lot of ways to obtain the various NES games, like treasure hunts and ghosts, but the only way you can directly buy an NES isn't from Tom Nook at all. Instead, it shows up at Crazy Red's Furniture Emporium, some kind of sketchy black market that only shows up in town on one randomly determined day out of each month. I guess I'll keep shaking trees till he shows up any day now. Okay, well, I've been stung by a lot of bees, made friends, lost friends. But it's the end of the month, and on the last day of each month, Tom Nook holds a raffle. You get raffle tickets for making certain purchases at his shop, which you can then redeem when he... You need 5 tickets for 1 entry. Looks like I'm waiting another Another month has passed. Crazy Red has come and gone, not bearing Balloon Fight, but instead a pool. I bought it, but it didn't make the sadness go away. I just want to play soccer. I saved up my raffle tickets this time. Maybe I won a blue dresser. Only 2 other prizes were available, neither of which were the NES. I didn't even have a chance. Even after 2 months of my real life, I still have nothing. But maybe there's a lesson here. You can't make life about instant gratification, foregoing human connection so you can spend all day playing Wario's Woods. You gotta get out there, into Wario's Woods. Be a part of your community. Leave the world a better place than you found it. Sure, it's okay and even necessary to take time for yourself, play your little games, but it's also important to share your joy with others and to help them with their problems when you can. They'll help you in return, and you'll start to understand what being loved and cared for feels like. It doesn't matter how long it takes to get the NES. You could think of it as being like real life. You can't just buy a console. You have to save up for it, especially when you're a kid, and that sense of achievement is what makes all of the luxuries in life so worthwhile. Man, fuck that. I'm just gonna cheat. I'm proud of the person I've become. Can you say the same about yourself? I feel a little bad I didn't earn this legitimately, but after 2 literal months, I decided I actually wanted to finish this script. Maybe I'll start from scratch and try to work for it someday, if only for my own fulfillment. But for now, I can't fully speak to that experience because I haven't earned any of these games, nor was I able to get any through Nintendo's old giveaways or limited time codes. In a way, Animal Crossing with the NES games obtained through these means is sort of like playing with a special event Pokemon. It could only really be done properly during a very specific window of time. You know, in a way that makes them games I can't play. I can play Animal Crossing, but I can't win one of Nintendo's special memory cards with NES games on it. Am I really playing Animal Crossing at that point? Who's to say? What I do know is that having these games sprinkled in as little bonuses is sort of like the Yakuza treatment. They're not being hailed as masterworks in a museum, they're just games, like they were when they first came out. The Geek Critique made a really good video talking about his experience playing Animal Crossing as a kid and seeing the NES titles through this lens, organically coming across and appreciating them without viewing them through other people's nostalgia. I recommend giving it a look. Should you play Animal Crossing? Yeah, maybe not for the NES games though. Save yourself some time. Instead, why not try Sega Genesis Classics? First released on Steam in 2010 with an eventual console release in 2018, the PC version follows the Capcom Arcade Stadium format, where you can buy the individual games off Steam. They're each $1 except the Sonic games, which are $5. Yeah, sure, Sonic Spinball's worth $5. That's not robbery. On a mass scale, why not? Who cares? Also, they delisted Sonic 1, 2, 3, and Knuckles from Steam in 2022, so people would buy Sonic Origins instead, which is a normal and ethical business decision. I got these years ago though, so I have them all. Sonic 1 and 2 are also in the console version, but the game with the Michael Jackson soundtrack is not. Back on track, the hub here is a 90s bedroom adorned with Sega memorabilia. The axe in this kid's bedroom is a bit of a stretch though. I don't think they ever sold those. Officer, wait, I can explain. I just wanted to be like my hero, Gilius Thunderhead. You can grab games off the shelf and you get to put the cartridges with their inaccurate label art into the console. You can even play them off the TV, although unfortunately you can't move the camera like in Capcom Arcade Stadium. You also get a lot of pixel scaling options, borders, a scanline filter, and a mirror mode. So if you want to play biblically accurate Sonic 2, be my guest. If you want to get really immersed, you can even play in VR. The game provides a few extra achievements, leaderboards, and even challenges for variety. These challenges are sort of like the ones offered on Switch Online. You start from a specific condition or save state and have to complete an objective, like beating a boss with low health or beating Green Hill Zone in mirror mode under a time limit. These are really cool, and they're good for getting a first taste of games you haven't played, although not every game has challenges associated with it. Most of these are pretty tough, too. We could have used some lighter ones to balance things out, although even playing the Genesis version of Virtua Fighter 2 is kind of a challenge. I don't know if I'm strong enough for that one. I guess it does kind of suck being stuck with the inferior Genesis ports of games like that and Space Harrier 2, but to be fair, that does replicate the experience of being a kid in the 90s, stuck at the mercy of your allowance and whatever knowledge you could accrue from gaming magazines. You probably would have collected a lot of trash. It's like role-playing. One of the coolest things is the fact that when you open up your installation files, you can see that you've effectively just been given ROMs of all the games you you bought. These can be opened in any emulator you want or patched however you please. The game has workshop support, so you can play ROM hacks pretty easily, or other Genesis games that people just pirated and imported the ROMs for. Presentation-wise, this is one of the better compilations, especially with the focus on a single console. One issue though, where are the manuals? I'm more forgiving of this with Animal Crossing since the games are just fun little bonuses, but I'm role-playing! This kid has the original boxes and cartridges for all their games. He even has that stupid axe! Where are the manuals? Other extras would be cool too. He has these posters, and I mentioned gaming magazines earlier. You'd think he has some of those. Maybe he sold them all to get that axe. Imagine this game with some Namco Museum or Sonic Mega Collection-esque extras. As far as contextualization goes, that'd be the bow on top, but it's still a good time. Let's take it a little further. How else could we put old games into perspective? Like I mentioned earlier, there's nothing like an authentic old-school controller. Switch Online pads, mini console controllers, stuff like that. I'm especially a fan of whenever a third-party manufacturer partners with a company to recreate their older controllers, just for funsies. Hyperkin's got these Xbox 360 controllers, or the Duke, if you hate yourself. Retrobit did some Saturn pads, all to replicate the feel of the original games. In this case, the physical feel. We're getting a little away from the original point though. Let's sail back to shore, nice and slow. While I carefully navigate through the potential flame war brewing amongst purists in my comment section, I'd like to remind you that this video is about arcade games first and foremost, and those controls are a little bit harder to replicate at home. You could get yourself a nice arcade stick for the coffee table, but it's not quite the same thing as playing on a real cabinet, is it? I don't even own a coffee table, I'm poor. Say goodbye to having a functional spine. Companies like Arcade1Up have been infiltrating stores like Target and Walmart for a while now, with their line of buildable arcade cabinets for the home. These are pretty authentic to a lot of their original games in terms of builds and artwork, although many feature more than one game per cabinet. Definitely preferable to blowing $500 on just Pac-Man. They offer these in a number of different form factors, although I feel like I usually see the smaller ones. And I suppose that's what these risers are for. They also offer countertop machines if you don't have space for a bigger one, or a coffee table. If your tastes veer into the incredibly obscure, or if you just want to do a lot of building and customization yourself, you may also want to consider getting a MAME cabinet. If you're a DDR player, you might consider DET. But now that we're back on dry land, you may be asking, wasn't this video about virtual arcades? I have my fancy setup, sure. I even bought a coffee table. But are there other pieces of that experience missing? Things like online leaderboards, multiplayer, and NPCs populating the arcade definitely help, but they're far from the end-all be-all. In-game crowd noises can only replicate so much of the excitement present in a room full of sweaty gamers gathered around Guitar Hero or DDR champions. One of the things that inspired this video, and the line of thinking running through it, was hearing about how the arcade setting shaped the Tower of Druaga and made it the success that it was. For those unacquainted, Druaga, I'm gonna have to say that a lot, so I better get it down now. Druaga, Druaga, Druaga. For those unacquainted, Druaga is a 1984 Namco arcade game designed by Masanobu Endo, who also did Xevious. That game was a vertical shooter, and like many of its contemporaries, didn't have a clear-cut ending. You could effectively play it forever. Endo himself regretted this, vowing to make a game that had a real, fulfilling conclusion that, quote, gave the player a sense of completion and achievement. That's where Druaga comes in. The game is a dungeon crawler with the structure of a maze. You have to collect a key on each of the game's 60 floors to open up the next one, all the while defeating enemies and finding hidden items. There's one item on every floor, and some, like extra armor and helmets, are required to progress. Being an 80s arcade game, a lot of things are rather obtuse and difficult to figure out, requiring a lot of mindless wandering and experimentation. If you've played the NES, Zelda, and Metroid games, it's kinda like that. Retro Games writer Mark Normandin did a great article about Druaga that actually notes the similarities between it and Zelda. There exists an interview with both Endo and Shigeru Miyamoto from 1986, around the time the first Zelda game came out, where Miyamoto talks about having an arcade cabinet with Druaga in Nintendo's offices. One can't help but imagine it was on his mind. Now, Zelda had a lot of tips and tricks in its manual, like info on how to defeat specific enemies and a map of the overworld, among other things. If an American player still found themselves stumped, they could pick up the latest issue of Nintendo Power to see if that could answer their question. They could also call the official Nintendo Power hotline, a gameplay two-way counseling service. This was operational until 2005. You couldn't Google a walkthrough back then, but there were certainly options if you got stuck. While it's not my area of expertise, I have to assume Japanese players had similar ways of finding assistance. Druaga's esoteric nature made it unlikely for one lone player to figure everything out on their own. No one was going to clear it on a blind first run or even a somewhat experienced 12th run. This was intentional, as Endo wanted players to share what they learned from playing the game with each other so that they could eventually work through its secrets together. I think the way Japanese translator Samuel Messner put this when talking about games like Druaga sums it up best. The story we generally tell over here is that every video game secret, real or otherwise, was shared on playgrounds across America between the most esteemed of gamers. That's true to a degree, but in Japan, many arcades had a slightly more elegant solution that Druaga popularized: the communal arcade notebook, a poorly documented but deeply important part of Japanese arcade culture. For someone like me, intensely interested in this type of history, but woefully incapable of reading any Japanese, it's especially tough to get a full understanding, but I'll do my best. Messner, who lived in Japan for a bit and spent time hanging around arcades and talking to their veterans, was nice enough to answer a few questions and provide some additional insight, so I've got to give him a special thanks before continuing. His inputs definitely helped inform this part of the video. For Druaga, it worked as I described. If you discovered some obscure secret, you could write it down to help whoever played next. In turn, if you needed help, you could refer to the existing notes. Working together, the arcade goers of a particular town could chip away at a game's mysteries, eventually beating it. This practice became somewhat commonplace after Druaga. These notebooks wouldn't be exclusively for secrets or forward progression either. People would also write general tips and tricks, like, say, what weapon might work best against a particular boss, or otherwise communicate with fellow arcade goers, using the notebook as a vessel. Messner mentioned that while these notebooks are called Koryaku Nota, walkthrough notebooks, they could at times be used for internet forum-style communication among local communities. Anecdotally, he also mentioned that the Mikado arcade in Japan currently keeps separate notebooks for walkthrough-style info and forum-style communication. He wasn't sure if this had been common practice in the old days, though. Very few of these notebooks have been saved. I was able to find a post by Japanese Twitter user SGP_EXCM128, very nice, with a few images of a notebook containing tips for the game Virtual On, which first saw release over a decade after Druaga. Sam also shared a tweet showing a similar notebook with tips for Druaga, although this one was compiled by a group of high school friends, rather than just sitting in the arcade itself. A few re-releases of Tower of Druaga, like Namco Museum Volume 3 on PS1, and the Arcade Archives release on PS4 and Switch, add an optional hint system, which one could argue is an attempt to replicate a communal notebook without the need for other human beings. This isn't a perfect solution, though. In fact, I'm not sure there is one beyond starting a Discord group with the gals and book clubbing your way through the game over the course of a month or something. While that does sound fun, it's still not quite the same thing. Normandin also compares Druaga to the Souls games, which have a hint system in the form of online messages left by other players. I think Mario Maker 2 kind of has this too. He theorizes that this is an intentional parallel to the notebook approach, and it's not hard to see it. I wonder if it would be possible for a game like Druaga or Virtual On to incorporate some kind of Souls-like hint system in a future re-release, or if there's too many logistical concerns. Trolls, people stealing tidbits from walkthroughs, or maybe even a simple lack of interest in playing a game that many would view as antiquated. It's hard to say. Alright, I've synthesized all of our findings today in the lab. Let's lay out the design for a perfect virtual arcade, if I were to make it. Naturally, this theoretical game would be a compilation. Let's say it's a Namco Museum. I like the idea of making it a Yakuza-like, but on a much smaller scale. A Yakuza light, if you will. You're the manager of a small arcade in a small town, where there's fairly few other things to do. Maybe we can also theme these other places around Namco in some way. I've seen Pac-Man basketball hoops and air hockey tables in arcades before. Maybe adapt things like those into minigames a la Yakuza. Rather than a traditional compilation, I'm envisioning a small campaign with a lot of little side quests. Imagine the Yakuza arcade side quests were their own game, themed around Namco instead of Sega. Maybe the story picks up right around the time Pac-Man comes out in 1980, progressing loosely in real time with some anachronistic details thrown in. There should be a good amount of unlockable games, but the starting roster shouldn't suck in case a casual player buys the game. The PS1 Namco Museums usually give you 6 to 7 games, so if our first year is is 1980, we can easily start with Pac-Man, Galaxian, Rally X, maybe some deeper cuts like Bombi or QDQ. But the well of beloved classics is admittedly a little dry after we extract those. Maybe we could have a separate mode where you can just pick games from a menu, the quick start option that the Wii games were sorely lacking. You could have a few more iconic games unlocked there from the start, let's say Dig Dug and Mappy. Back to the story, each day is spent trying to make your arcade more of a success. Maybe you hang flyers around town or play the games to become more of an expert. Eventually you'll get customers to show up, and they could have their own side quests for you, like beating their high score, or maybe a machine they like is broken and you have to fix it. Thrillville style. Get the little Thrillville minigames in there, maybe you could mop up some puke. These would reward you, either with good word of mouth for your arcade or more money. I like the idea of a Persona-style time management system where each activity takes some time out of the day. That could add a little challenge and keep the game moving. As time progresses, more games become available. Maybe you have to buy the cabinets with the money you earn. From there, we can add some of the customization from Pac-Man Museum Plus and Capcom Arcade Stadium, where you can place the cabinets wherever you want and maybe even choose what they look like. There's only so much room in your tiny arcade, so after a while, you'll either have to axe old machines or spend money to make your arcade larger. Maybe you could even hire more employees, sort of like the real estate management or cabaret clubs in Yakuza 0. Can you tell I like Yakuza 0? Yakuza 0 is pretty good. Some arcade games might have specific side quests associated with them, and maybe for something like Druaga, you could incorporate a version of the notebook system where talking to some arcade goers might let you in on their secrets. Maybe they could even offer hints as a reward for some of the side quests. Alternatively, you could literally have a notebook next to the machine, with more being written in it as time goes on. Your popularity could also factor into this. Maybe it's harder to get help if there are fewer people frequenting your arcade. Now, the scope of this game could easily get out of hand. I'm thinking for our purposes, the story could last like 10 years, from 1980 to 1990. That covers all the usual Namco staples, but it could also allow for a few weirder picks. Maybe you could even unlock some post-1990 bonus games for completing certain achievements or something. Let's say like Pac-Man Champion Edition, maybe some of the arrangement games. I want to keep the game list manageable, but still very large. This is a $60 game in my view, or $70, whatever. It's AAA, it's quadruple A even, it's quintuple A. Let's say you start with 4 or 5 games in story mode with a few extras in the quick start menu. I think we can add 3 to 5 additional games per year, and the need to actually play the story mode well to unlock them will keep things moving at a good pace. Here's a list as an example. Take this with a grain of salt. There's a good amount of games I haven't played, and it's more of a proof of concept than a definitive opinion. Feel free to comment your own if you like boosting engagement. That's a pretty healthy roster of just under 40 games. You could add bonuses like the arrangement titles for the post-game, but I think this is a decent structure. One obvious potential issue is that most of the well-known games are offloaded pretty early, but there's a lot of games in the back half too, with rarities that don't commonly see console releases, sequels to the more popular games, and the occasional cult hit like Splatterhouse. I think these games would serve the story just fine, and the people who only care about Pac-Man and Dig Dug will get everything they bought the compilation for pretty fast. We don't need to tell them that they don't need to pay $70 for those games. Now, I'm not a game developer, so I don't know how logistically difficult it would be to craft this campaign in addition to accurately emulating 40 games with the expected quality of life touches, but the 12-year-old in me thinks this sounds pretty cool. Now that we've theorized about a game that'll never get made, making ourselves kinda sad in the process, let's take a moment to appreciate what we do have. Arcades are on the decline, even in Japan. If you still have one near you, consider yourself lucky, especially if it's got more than the standard Pac-Man versus Super Mario Brothers and maybe a Street Fighter if you're lucky. I'm deeply fortunate to have a few in my area. You may be able to boot up whatever NES port of an 80s Namco game finds its way to your emulator of choice, but there's something to be said about authenticity, and even more to be said about context. The Tower of Druaga was torn apart by American game journalists when it was released for the Wii Virtual Console, because when you're presented with nothing but the game itself, it doesn't come off all that well through modern eyes. American players didn't experience this game like Japanese players did. But when you play it with a hint system or with other people in a way closer to how it was intended, closer to how it was actually played in 80s Japan, I have to imagine you can understand and appreciate it a lot better, even if you don't like it that much. The games I've talked about today help to do that in various ways, and I consider that valuable and interesting. I'd certainly have never become such an Outrun fan just playing Genesis ROMs off a list. I hope you come away from this video not just thinking about and appreciating the care that can go into presenting these older games in an accurate and respectful manner, but to also cultivate that same sort of curiosity and care within yourself. Old games should be approached like a well-loved stuffed animal. Maybe it's kind of gross and you can see the age in it. It might not even be for you, but if you approach it with a gentle hand, you might see in it what others were able to all those years ago. I'm Jonii, and I've got to go. I've got a hot date lined up at Kyoko's Fantasy Zone. Peace.